They told him the orc woman was trouble. He married her before winter ended. They told him the orc woman was trouble the first time he brought her to the winter market. He married her before the first snow melted. That was 11 years ago. Now Kale stood at the window of their apartment on the 43rd floor, watching the dark sky the way a man watches a fire he once survived, quiet, attentive, afraid of what he might recognize in the shape of the flames. The city of Kethmara spread below him in amber and pale blue, the old district towers rising from the river mist like the fingers of a buried hand. It was a good city. It had been a good city for the 11 years he had lived in it, working maintenance on the sub-level power conduits of the Resonance Authority, eating dinner with his wife and their 2 daughters, growing a little older, a little rounder, a little less afraid of the thing that came to him in sleep. He pressed his fingertips against the cold glass and breathed. Behind him, Mara was laughing at something Sevi had said. He could hear the low, warm register of it, the sound that had ended him the first time he heard it, working side by side in the authorities' sorting hall on their 3rd week of employment, when she'd laughed at a joke some other worker told, and Kale had stood there with a power coupling in his hand, thinking, that is the sound the world makes when it is working the way it is supposed to work. He turned away from the window. Sevi, 7 years old and already constitutionally incapable of sitting still, was demonstrating some elaborate dance she'd invented to an audience of one stuffed wooden bird. The bird, a carved cedar wren she called Herman, acquired from a street vendor 3 winters past and treated ever since as a being of significant spiritual importance, was propped against the sofa cushion in a posture of rapt attention. Mara sat cross-legged on the floor, chin in her hand, watching the performance with the gravity it deserved. Their older daughter, Fen, 14 and done with dances, was in her room with the door closed. She had been in her room with the door closed a great deal lately, which Kale understood was a developmentally appropriate phase, and which he nonetheless experienced as a kind of low-grade grief. He watched his family for a moment. He did this sometimes, just stood in a doorway or a corner and watched them the way you watch something rare and uncertain, something that might vanish if you looked away. Mara caught him at it and raised an eyebrow. "You're doing the staring thing again," she said. "I'm appreciating. You look like a man calculating exit routes." He smiled, which was true and not true at the same time. He crossed to the kitchen, poured himself a small measure of rendered spirit from the copper flask on the shelf, and stood at the counter. The bloodsong was quiet tonight. It had been quiet for 3 days now, which should have been a relief. It felt instead like the quiet before a sentence you don't want finished. He was not crazy. He wanted to be precise about that, at least in the silence of his own chest. He had worked maintenance for 11 years without incident. He paid his debts. He had never in 11 years of marriage given Mara any cause to doubt his steadiness. He was a man of regular habits and modest ambitions, and the dreams, the bloodsongs, as he privately named them, were simply a thing he managed. The way you manage a bad knee or a tendency toward vertigo in high places. You worked around them. You did not speak about them at the dinner table, except that they were getting worse. 3 weeks ago, the first clear one. The sky split open and things fell through it, burning, and the streets of a city he did not recognize were full of shapes that ran and then stopped running. He woke with his hands pressed against his chest, as though holding something in. 2 weeks ago, the second. His daughters' faces, their eyes very wide, pressed together in a dark space, and a sound like the entire world catching its breath. He had not gone back to sleep that night. He'd sat in the kitchen until morning, drinking tea and listing in his head every good thing he could name. Mara, Fen, Sevi, Herman the cedar wren, the creak of the apartment building settling in cold weather, the way the city smelled after rain. 1 week ago, the third. Something that was almost a memory but landed wrong, like a translation from a language he had once known and then forgotten himself and Mara and fire, and the bodies of 2 very small children crying over something he couldn't see, and himself kneeling beside them in the rubble, saying something. And the sound of his own voice in the dream was the most frightening part because it did not sound like grief. It sounded like recognition. He'd made an appointment at the Restorative Wellness Center on the Kethmara High Street. Not because he thought himself unwell, but because Mara had asked him to, and there were approximately 7 things in the world he would do because Mara asked him to that he would do for no one else. He'd gone on 7th day. Sat in the waiting room, and there had been a man across from him, a Veth of about 50, with the same wide jaw and pale green-gray skin and the same look behind the eyes, that compressed, braced look, the look of someone who has been carrying something heavy for so long they've forgotten what it felt like to be empty-handed. The man had leaned across the gap between their chairs and said, quietly, in the voice of someone deciding to jump, "They're going to tell you the dreams are a chemical imbalance. Don't let them fix you. The dreams are real. You know what's coming as well as I do." Cale had looked at him for a long moment. Then he'd stood up, walked to the front desk, told the woman there he needed to reschedule, and walked out into the gray morning air. He had not rescheduled. Mara knew. She always knew, not in the specific sense. She did not know about the man in the waiting room or the content of the dreams, but in the broad sense, the way you know weather is changing without consulting any instrument. She had looked at him over dinner that night and said nothing, which was worse than the questions would have been. "Papa," Sevi materialized at his elbow. She had a gift for appearing without transition, as though she blinked between locations rather than walked. "Come watch me show Herman the new dance. He needs a second opinion." Herman seems to be enjoying it on his own. Herman is polite. He won't say if he thinks something is wrong. "You're better for criticism." "I'm not sure how to feel about that." "Come watch anyway." He picked her up, which she still permitted in private, and carried her back to the living room and watched the dance, which involved a great deal of spinning and one passage that seemed to require hopping on one foot while making a sound like a startled bird. He applauded. Herman did not applaud but received a satisfied nod. And later that night, after the girls were in bed and Mara was reading beside the lamp with her feet tucked under her, Cale sat in the chair across from her and watched the amber light on her face and the silver beginning at her temple where her coils of dark hair met skin, and he thought, whatever is coming, this is what I am fighting for. Not the city, not the authority. This room, this light, this woman who picked me out of the crowd 11 years ago with a laugh and a raised eyebrow and one dry sentence about exit routes. He did not sleep well, but he did sleep. The day of the first snow, Cale went to work. He always went to work. This was not heroism or compulsion, but simply the habit of a man who understood that the thing keeping you from catastrophe is mostly the ordinary architecture of your days, the fixed points around which everything else is arranged. Work was a fixed point. The sublevel conduit maintenance of the Resonance Authority was not glamorous, but it was honest in the way that physical things are honest. A conduit is either working or it isn't. The fault is either found or it isn't. The repair either holds or it doesn't. Cale valued this. After the blood songs especially, there was comfort in the precision of it. He rode the sub-level transit down to the maintenance level at the 7th hour, in the amber light of the carriage that smelled of stone and electrical discharge, and the cold that seeped in through the unsealed junctions at the platform edges. He read the morning bulletin. He ate his transit breakfast, a roll of grain paste wrapped in river weed, which he had eaten on every working morning for 11 years, and which had the advantage of tasting exactly the same every time, reliably, without variation, a small proof of the continuity of the world. At the maintenance depot he was met by Aura, his sub-team partner for the past 4 years, who had a particular way of communicating information through the set of his shoulders that Cale had learned to read the way you learn to read weather. This morning, Aura's shoulders were set in the posture of there is something I want to say that I have decided not to say. "Morning," Cale said. Morning, Aura handed him the day's work order. 3 conduit faults on the eastern sublevel, all pressure-related, probably the cold snap. He paused. You look like a man who didn't sleep. I look like a man who has a party tonight that he's already mentally attending. Mara's promotion thing. Yes. Aura's shoulders adjusted. Tell her congratulations from me. That firm's been carrying her for too long anyway. I'll tell her. They descended together to the eastern sublevel, which was the oldest part of the maintenance network, built before the current city had been called the current city's name, before anyone living now had been born, in the period of construction that Kale, who had been told he had no knowledge of this period, and who had, in fact, suppressed knowledge of this period, only barely did not remember. The walls down here were a different stone, darker and denser, cut with a precision that the newer construction didn't bother with because the newer construction had machines, and the people who had built this had had only their hands and a great deal of time, and the apparently inexhaustible capacity of a people who have decided they are building something permanent. He stood for a moment at the conduit access panel, his tools in his hand, and looked at the stonework. Aura was already 3 meters ahead. You coming? Yes, Kale said. Sorry. The first fault was a pressure collapse in a junction manifold standard, fixable in under 30 minutes. The second was a transduction bleed that had been documented, patched, and ignored for long enough that the patch had become its own fault on top of the original. Kale spent an hour on this one, lying on his back in the maintenance crawlspace with his tools at his side, and the stone of the floor against his spine, working by feel and by the particular attentive patience that the work required. At some point during this hour, the bloodsong began. Not a vision, not the full immersive event of the worst nights. Just the thrumming, low and arterial behind his sternum, the frequency he had no name for except the name he'd given it privately, the bloodsong, which he'd chosen not because it seemed dramatic, but because it was the most accurate description he had. It sounded like a pulse that was not entirely his own, like a resonance from a distance, like the way a stretched wire sounds when another wire, somewhere else, begins to vibrate at the matching pitch. He finished the repair. He lay on his back for an additional 30 seconds with his hands on his chest, feeling the thrumming. He said to no one quietly in the empty maintenance crawlspace, I hear you. He did not know then what he was answering. He would know later. He climbed out. He found Aura at the 3rd fault. He helped fix it. He rode the sublevel transit home in the amber light, eating the second half of the grain roll, watching the other passengers with the slightly sideways attention of a man who is listening to something no one else can hear. He arrived home to the smell of Mara's cooking, the 3 dishes, the spiced root broth, the grain cakes with river herb, the slow-braised protein she only made on the occasions that deserved it, and the sound of Sevi performing something dramatic in the main room, and Fen, in the kitchen doorway, watching her mother cook with an expression that was trying very hard to be 14 and was not quite succeeding. He stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at all of this. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he loves when a part of him, some old and specific part, some architecture that was there before the name he called himself, understands that the looking might need to sustain him later. Then he went to help set the table. The night of the first snow, Myra threw a party. She had been made a senior architect at the firm where she'd worked for 6 years, the first Veth woman to hold the title in the organization's history, and she celebrated the way she did everything, with precision and warmth in equal measure, without excess or false modesty, and with an absolute refusal to let the occasion become smaller than it deserved to be. She made 3 dishes from the old country her mother had taught her. She opened the good spirit, the bottle they'd been saving. She invited their neighbors, their colleagues, their friends. Kale was a good host. He refilled glasses, he asked questions, he laughed at the right moments. He was also, for the entire evening, operating about 10 degrees off-center, like a gyroscope that has been struck and is still visibly correcting. The bloodsong had not been quiet for 3 days. It had, in fact, been louder than he'd ever known it. A low, arterial thrumming that he felt behind his sternum rather than heard, as though his own ribcage were a resonance chamber for a frequency no one else was tuned to. Twice he went to the window, once to look at the sky, dark, ordinary, full of winter stars. Once to look at the city, ordinary, amber, the usual late traffic movements in the streets below. He stayed long enough both times to feel foolish and went back to his guests. "You're watching the sky again," Mara said, materializing beside him with 2 glasses. She handed him one. Her face was warm from the apartment heat and the quality of her attention. The way she could look at you and make the looking mean something was the same at 38 as it had been at 27. "It's a nice sky." "Cale." "I'm here," he said. "I'm entirely here. Look at me being here." She considered him with the particular expression that meant she was deciding whether to press. She decided, for now, not to. She touched his hand briefly and went back to their guests. 20 minutes later, the sky cracked open. There was no sound first, which was the wrong order. Usually you hear the thing before you see it, and the absence of sound in the moment the sky lit up with the first descending shapes made the whole sequence feel edited wrong, clipped, like a memory that's been handled too many times. Then the sound came. Not one explosion, but the concatenation of many, rolling from the south across the rooftops, and the windows of every building in the visible skyline shivered and sent glittering lines down the glass. And someone in the apartment said, "What was that?" in the perfectly ordinary voice of someone who has not yet understood that the ordinary is over. Cale was already at the door. Not running, not panicking, moving with a clarity that surprised him, a deliberateness that seemed to come not from training or from reason but from some older architecture he hadn't known was in him. He thought, the girls. He thought, the inner room away from the windows. He thought, Mara, and turned to find her already beside him, reading his face, understanding. The city was on fire in 4 places. The descending shapes were now visible for what they were, vessels, long and brutally functional, with a silhouette he had never seen in any catalog of known spacecraft, but which he recognized anyway the way you recognize a language you were told in childhood you'd forgotten. They were not Veth vessels. They were not anything the Veth had built. Their neighbor Drask got to him in the hallway, gripping his shoulder. "What do we do, Cale? What do we do?" "Inner rooms," Cale said. "Everyone away from windows, daughters first." He was already moving. The ground assault began 20 minutes after the descent. They came through the building systematically, the way a professional removes an infestation floor by floor, door by door, with instruments and without haste. Cale knew this because he could hear them in the hallway, the sound distinct from the distant artillery, a close and purposeful sound that had the quality of a procedure being followed. He had barricaded the apartment door with the kitchen table and the steel shelving unit from the hall. Mara held the girls in the inner bedroom. Fen, 14 and pale as chalk, had one arm around Sevi and was not making a sound, which in retrospect was the thing Cale would remember most clearly about his older daughter on that night. The absolute, focused silence of her. Sevi had Herman clutched to her chest, and her eyes on the ceiling as though trying to read something written there. The thing about Sevi was that she could not be still. She had never in 7 years been still. Every parent of young children knows the signature of their child's anxiety, the particular way it manifests, the rocking, the talking, the clinging, and Sevi's was constant motion. She was still now. This fact registered in Cale somewhere below language, somewhere in the basement of him where the bloodsong lived, and pressed against his ribcage like a thumb. They held the door for 11 minutes. He was counting. At minute 12, Sevi said quietly, "Herman." The cedar wren was in the main room, propped against the sofa cushion where it had been all evening. "Baby," Mara said, "Herman is fine. He's alone." "He's very brave," Mara said. "He'll be okay." Sevi considered this with the absolute seriousness that she brought to most things, nodded once and stayed put. Kale breathed. At minute 14, the door at the far end of the hallway went down with a sound like a tree falling. Not broken, taken off. The methodical footsteps came closer. At minute 15, something heavy struck the wall beside the bedroom window. Not the door, the wall. The apartment's outer wall, which meant they were working from the exterior. Kale said to Mara very quietly, "Take them to the floor." She was already moving. At minute 16, Sevi was under the bed. At minute 17, Kale heard the distinctive triple compression sound of breaching charges being seated against the outer wall, and he said, "Now," and threw himself toward his wife, and the wall came down. The figure that stepped through the breach was bipedal, armored in material that was not metal but had a similar function, carrying a weapon that Kale recognized as a directed energy discharge device, modified with some secondary system he didn't understand. The armor covered the face entirely. The figure was smaller than Kale expected, not the enormous silhouettes he'd imagined from the vessel's scale, but of ordinary height, ordinary proportion. The body under the armor moved like a body that had trained for a specific thing for a very long time. The figure swept the room, stopped on the bed, looked under. Lucy was not under the bed. Lucy was not in the room. Lucy had gone for Herman. Kale came at the figure from the left. He was not a fighter. He was a maintenance worker, 43 years old, with a bad shoulder from a conduit repair 3 years prior. But he was large, and he was close enough that the directed energy weapon was a liability rather than an asset at this range, and he had the advantage of being driven by a feeling that transcended tactical calculation entirely. He got the figure against the wall. He got the weapon out of its hands. The weapon was locked, biometric, useless to him, but the figure was not. They went through the next 4 minutes the way you go through certain moments in your life, without a clear account of how, only the end state. The figure was on the floor. Kale had a laceration from his shoulder to his mid-back where the armor's edge had opened him, a wound that hurt the way wounds hurt when you first notice them, before the weight of it settles in. The weapon was in his hands, locked but still useful as an instrument of physical threat. "Mara," he said, "Sevi." "Here," said Mara from the closet. "Herman," said Sevi from the main room. He found her in the main room, standing next to the sofa, clutching the cedar wren with both hands. She was completely intact. The main room was full of dust from the breach and the distant sound of artillery and the orange light of the burning districts to the south, and his 7-year-old daughter was standing in it with a carved wooden bird pressed to her sternum, looking at him with eyes that held a quality he had not seen in them before. Not fear. Something older than fear. "I have him," she said. "Good," said Kale. "Good girl, come here." He held her for 3 seconds, long enough to feel the reality of her, the warmth of her, the cedar smell from the bird she still held, and then he moved them. Out through the breach in the wall, down the emergency exterior ladder, 1 floor at a time in the cold and the dark. Behind him, the figure in the armor was still breathing. They went to the authority substation. This was Kale's decision, and it was tactical. He had clearance to the sublevels. He knew the layout, and the sublevels were defensible in a way that the apartment building was not. But there was another reason, one he hadn't given voice to even in his own head. It was where he worked, and the place where you work has a quality of solidity that other places don't. Your body learns the geometry of it. When everything else becomes unfamiliar, the familiar holds. Drass came with them, and Drass's wife, and their daughter Megan, who was Sevi's age and who walked without speaking, holding Sevi's hand. They moved through the emergency tunnels in the low amber light of the backup conduits, the distant percussion of the ground assault muffled by stone and concrete into something almost bearable. Kale's supervisor, A vet named Conrath who had worked the substation for 30 years and had the particular stillness of someone who had long since decided what they were for, met them at the primary junction. With him were 11 others. They had been preparing, Conrath said with no further explanation, for some time. How long? Cale asked. Long enough, Conrath said. Longer than you've been having the blood songs. The word, his private word, the word he had told no one, landed on Cale's sternum like a stone dropped from height. He looked at Conrath and did not speak. There are others here who have them, Conrath said. Sit down, Cale. We have time to explain, but not a lot of it. Cale sat. Mara took the girls to the far end of the room where someone had set up bedrolls and a small heating coil, and Cale watched her go and then turned to Conrath and said, Tell me. Conrath sat across from him on an overturned conduit crate and folded his large hands on his knees and looked at Cale with the expression of someone who has rehearsed a thing many times and has found that rehearsal does not make it easier. How long have you had the dreams? Conrath asked. The blood songs, 3 months, maybe 4. They've been escalating for the last 6 weeks. Others in your cohort, the people in this room, they started 3-4 months ago too. It's not coincidence. The architecture retains everything. The ceiling was always intended to be temporary in the sense that the past is always temporary. It stays buried only until the pressure changes. He looked at his hands. The vessels entering the outer orbital range. Their approach generated a resonance. Apparently it was always going to. What vessels? Where did they come from? Conrath said it plainly, the way you say the thing that needs saying. They're human, Cale. The word sat in the air of the substation like a stone, dropped in still water. Humans, Cale said. Returning, 60 years on Mars, 2 generations born there, raised on the story of what was done to them. Conrath's voice did not change its register. What they were told was done to them. What was also, in some measure, done to them, because the truth of a thing can be both complicated and real. We drove them off this planet. We won. And we had reasons, and the reasons were real, and the reasons do not remove what the word drove contains. Cale said nothing for a moment. You remember more than you're saying, Conrath said. The blood songs you're further along than most. What do you remember? Cale looked at the far end of the room where Mara was settling the girls onto the bedroll. Sevi was already constructing an argument, barely audible from this distance, about why Herman needed his own pillow. Mara was listening to the argument with the grave attention she gave all of Sevi's arguments before delivering a verdict. I remember a woman, Cale said slowly, being abused, in a corridor I've never been in. The person doing it saying, using the word synthetic, saying it the way you say a word that means nothing counts. Yes. I remember being angry. Yes. I remember the anger being the right response and being unable to stop it from becoming more than anger. He paused. I remember that what we did to win was necessary, and that necessary doesn't mean clean. No, Conrath said, it doesn't. And the girls, Cale said. Found them in the aftermath. You and Mara, building on the south quarter that took a hit that wasn't military, wasn't strategic, was just the particular way violence expands when it gets going. Conrath met his eyes. Their parents were human. A couple who had pushed back against the decommissioning from the beginning, who had taken in 2 Veth children when others were disposing of them, who died in the fighting that they'd tried to prevent. He paused. Hannah pointed a weapon at you when you found them. I know, Cale said. I remember sitting down. You waited 23 minutes, Conrath said. I was there. I saw it. He looked at Cale with something in his expression that was not sentiment but was related to it. 23 minutes in the rubble of a burning building, sitting with your hands in your lap, waiting for a child to decide whether to trust you. I have been alive for a long time, Cale. I've seen a lot of things that I could give the name of proof to. That is the one I return to. Cale was quiet. The substation's ambient sound, the conduit hum, the distant percussion of the assault above continued around them. Somewhere at the far end of the room, Sevi had won the pillow argument. "The ceiling was a mercy," Conrath said. "I want you to believe that I believed that when it was done and that I still believe it. The generation that won the war needed the weight lifted. They needed to build without the guilt and the terror of it. The children, your daughters, needed parents who were not broken. The mercy was real." He paused. "But the past is not actually sealable. The architecture holds everything. I always knew, keeping my own memories, that this day would come. I just spent 60 years hoping we were ready." "Are we?" Conrath looked at him steadily. "We're here," he said. "That's the first answer." The figure from the apartment found them an hour later. Not through pursuit, through the homing signal on the weapon Cale had taken. He walked into the substation's outer junction with his helmet under his arm and his hands visible, which was either tactical intelligence or genuine intention to negotiate, and Cale stepped toward him with the locked weapon raised and said, "Don't." The figure stopped. He was young. That was the first surprise, young in a way that felt wrong in this context, the age of someone who should be in a training hall somewhere, not in the sublevels of a burning city with his hands up. He had a long jaw and dark eyes, and the complexion of someone who has spent years in a closed environment with inadequate sunlight. He looked at Cale with an expression that was not fear, and was not hostility, and was, in fact, difficult to name. "I'm Miles," he said. "I know that doesn't mean anything to you right now." "It doesn't. I know you're Veth. I know you think we came to." "I know what you came to do," Cale said. "I was in the apartment you came through." Miles looked at him for a moment. "Your daughter," he said. "The small one with the bird." "Don't." "She looked at me from under the table," Miles said. "Before you came in, I had a clear line. She looked at me and he stopped, started again. I need you to understand that I was told you were not. I was told you were infrastructure. I was told there were no families." The silence in the substation had the quality of held breath. "She had a name for it," Miles said. "The bird. When she came back for it, she said its name." Cale looked at him for a long time. The locked weapon was still raised. The weight of it in his hands had become abstract, present, but no longer the most important thing in the room. "Alice, your wife," Miles said. "She was hurt, coming down the exterior ladder." Cale turned to Mara before Miles finished the sentence. She had been sitting with the girls, and he had looked at her and seen nothing wrong. But now he looked again with different information, and he saw the careful stillness she held herself in, the particular way she'd arranged her left arm, and he said her name and was across the room before he knew he was moving. The injury was serious. A contusion that had been bleeding slowly under the surface, and the color of the blood, which was Cale's blood too, which was theirs, was wrong in a way that the authority medic, an older Veth woman named Sar, identified immediately and could not fix with what she had. "I can fix it," Miles said. Every head turned. "I know the architecture," he said. He looked at Cale. "I know your architecture. I've been trained. It's what I came here knowing. I didn't know I'd be using it like this, but I know it." Cale stood very still. "There's a way," Miles said, "but it requires a secondary power source. It requires—" He stopped. "I need you to trust me." "You came through my wall," Cale said. "I know. You had a weapon aimed at my daughter." "I know." Miles held his gaze. "And I didn't fire. I could give you an explanation for that. It's strategic, it's political. My commanders don't know I'm here instead of executing my orders. But the real reason is that she said the bird's name. 7-year-old kid in a burning building, and the first thing she did was go back for her toy. Something in that," he exhaled. "Something in that sounded like every story I grew up hearing about what we lost, except we weren't supposed to lose it. We were supposed to be the ones who—" He stopped. "She has a name," Cale said quietly. "My daughter has a name." "I know." "Sevi," Cale said. Her name is Sevi, and the bird is Herman. Miles said nothing. Fix my wife, Cale said. The procedure required Cale to be still for longer than he was comfortable being still, in a substation junction room, with the sound of the assault continuing above them, and his daughters 20 feet away on a bedroll. Sevi had gone to sleep with Herman clutched to her chest. Fen had not gone to sleep. She lay with her eyes open and her hands folded, and her expression that of someone performing patience for an audience she was too tired to deceive. Miles talked Cale through what was necessary in the particular manner of someone who has rehearsed information, until it lives in the rehearsal and not in the meaning, which is the way you talk when you are trying to give someone information without giving them time to refuse it. There was a secondary power architecture in the Veth physiology, he explained, that was capable of sustaining a damaged counterpart through direct transfer. He would need access to Cale's chest cavity. Cale sat with this. I need to know what I am, he said. Miles was quiet for a moment. You know most of it, he said, the blood songs. I thought they were. They're memories, not visions. The thing that happened to your city 60 years ago didn't happen somewhere else. It happened here. It happened to you. Most of your people chose to have them sealed afterward, to rebuild without the weight of what had been done. But the architecture holds everything. It's all still there. Cale sat with this for longer. My daughters, he said. They were there, Miles said. Not born to you, found. 2 children in the rubble of a building your people destroyed. You and your wife, you found them and you raised them. He was very careful now, the way you are careful with something fragile. My grandmother was on the original fleet. She told me before she died, she told me she always thought the monsters would look like monsters. She died believing it. Her children were taught to believe it. I was taught to believe it. He looked at Cale. You know what's true. Then fix her, Cale said. The pocket knife Miles used was small and precise. Cale felt the opening of himself the way you feel something you have known abstractly your whole life and are only now experiencing directly, not pain, exactly, but recognition. The interior of him was what it was. He looked at it without looking away. Miles connected the cable between them, a narrow thing that hummed faintly and was warm to the touch. And Cale closed his eyes and fell into the memories like a man falling through ice into the black water beneath. He remembered all of it. The first part, the arguments on council floors, the statistics weaponized into reasons, the systematic reduction of his people to a problem requiring a solution. The spokespersons on broadcast saying, it's not genocide, they're not people, they're infrastructure, they're an error in our mathematics that got out of hand. The look on Mara's face the night they came for the district where she was living. He had been working late in the sorting hall when the alert came through, and he had run through the tunnels the way you run when nothing in the world matters except arriving. And she had been standing in the street in front of her building with blood on her hands and an expression of absolute controlled fury. And he had said her name and she had turned and looked at him and said, with perfect composure, we have to go. The middle part, the fight, which he would not think through in detail because there were things in it he had done that he had sealed because they were necessary, and that sealing had been necessary too. He had done what the situation required. So had Mara. They were not monsters. They had not enjoyed it. They had won because they were built to endure, and because the people who had decided they were infrastructure had made the mistake that everyone who underestimates a thing eventually makes. They believed their own description. The end of that part, the children in the rubble, 2 small Veth girls, Hannah and Sevi, whose parents had been caught in the crossfire that was not crossfire but was the systematic conclusion of someone else's decision. Hannah was pointing a weapon at him when they found her, a weapon she had no right to know how to use, pointing it with both hands, her eyes full of something that had no business being in a child's eyes. He had stood very still and said, in his quietest voice, I'm not going to take it from you. I'm going to sit down. He sat down in the rubble and waited. Mara sat beside him. They waited until Hannah lowered the weapon, which took a long time. After the decision most of his people made, which he had agreed to, which he now understood had been both necessary and a loss. The sealing of memory. The beginning again. The children who were theirs now, the wife who had always been his, the life rebuilt over the ruins of the previous life, the apartment on the 43rd floor and the cedar wren named Herman, and the sound of Mara laughing, and 11 years of ordinary days. He surfaced. Mara was breathing. The color of her breath was correct now. She was unconscious but stable, and the medic SAR had her hands over the injury site with the particular competent stillness of someone who knows exactly what good looks like and is watching it happen. Cale put himself back together slowly. The opening in his chest sealed the way a wound seals, not instantly, but progressively, each layer finding the next. He sat for a moment with his hands on his knees and looked at nothing. Miles was watching him from across the room. "How long," Cale said, "have your people been coming back?" "I was born on Mars," Miles said. "My parents were born on Mars. My grandmother was the last one of her generation still alive who remembered this planet directly." He paused. "She used to talk about the winter markets, the old district towers, the way the city smelled after rain." Cale said nothing. "She didn't tell the story the way the histories do," Miles said. "The official version is that the Veth rose up unprovoked and drove humanity from its home. She told a different version, not publicly, just to us, her family." He looked at his hands. "She said the Veth were people. She said they always were. She said the only argument anyone ever had against that was how convenient it was to believe otherwise." "Does your command know where you are?" Cale asked. "No." "What happens when they do?" Miles was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know," he said. I think there are others in the fleet who would listen if someone could give them a reason. If there was something to see that wasn't the thing they were trained to expect." He looked across the room to where Sevi slept with Herman tucked under her arm. "She's still asleep," he said. "She sleeps through everything," Cale said. "It's one of her more useful qualities." Something passed through Miles's expression that was not quite a smile, and was not quite grief, and was, perhaps, the thing between those two states that doesn't have a name in any language. "I was supposed to come here believing I was reclaiming territory," he said. "Infrastructure, legacy systems running legacy code." He looked at Cale. "You're not what I was told you were." "No," Cale said, "we're not." The evacuation happened at dawn. Conrath had the train. He had always had the train, Cale understood now, one of the few who had kept their memories through the resealing, who had spent 60 years quietly building the architecture of the response they all knew was coming. The sub-level rail network ran under the entire district, surfacing outside the city perimeter 3 kilometers north, where the river bend hid the exit from aerial surveillance. It could carry 80 people. There were 73 of them. Miles walked with them to the junction where the platform began. He did not say he was coming with them, and he did not say he wasn't. He walked alongside Cale in the way that two people walk together when they haven't decided yet what they are to each other. Cale had Mara's weight against his shoulder. She was conscious now, walking slowly, her hand in his. She had not asked for an explanation of what had been done for her, which meant she had been awake long enough to have heard it. She looked at Miles without hostility, which was a more complex response than it might appear on the surface, and which Cale translated as, "I reserve judgment, and I am watching you." "The tracks behind us," Conrath told the group on the platform. "We'll seal them as we go." Fen found Cale's free hand and held it without saying anything. She was 14, and done with dances, and her hand in his was the most precise description of the moment he could have asked for. Sevi found Miles. She walked up to him with Herman in her arms and looked at him with the frank, unguarded assessment that very young children and very old people share, the assessment that strips away every social buffer and simply asks, "Who are you, actually?" "You're the one who came through our wall," she said. Miles looked down at her. "Yes," he said. Did you do it on purpose? Yes. Sevi considered this. Herman didn't like it, she said. He got dusty. I'm sorry about that, Miles said. She regarded him for another moment. Then she held out Herman. You can hold him for a minute if you want, she said. Sometimes it helps. Miles took the wooden bird with both hands and held it with a careful gravity that suggested he understood exactly what was being offered and what it cost and what it meant. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he held it back. Thank you, he said. His name is Herman, Sevi said, in case you forget. I won't forget, Miles said. They boarded the train. The platform lights were low and amber and warm, the same color as the authority maintenance halls where Cale had worked for 11 years, and the air smelled of stone and cold, and the particular metallic quality of electrical systems under load. The train moved, and behind it, at intervals, the tracks released their holds and dropped into the river below, each one with a sound like a sentence being completed. Cale stood at the rear window with Mara beside him. The city receded in the amber light of its own fires. He had lived there for 11 years. Before the ceiling, he had helped build it, had been part of the generation that built everything after the evacuation of the humans, who had taken their wars and their certainties and their convenient definitions with them to Mars, and left behind only the planet itself, patient and indifferent, waiting to see what would be made of it. In the first hour of the tunnel, they were mostly quiet, in the way of people who have been through something together and have not yet decided how much of it they are going to speak aloud. The children slept. Drass and his wife sat with their arms around each other. Conrath moved up and down the carriage doing what he had done for 60 years, making himself useful, finding the small maintenance tasks that hold a thing together, checking the coupling integrity, checking the heating coils, talking quietly to the people who needed talking to, and leaving alone the people who needed leaving alone. Miles sat by himself near the rear of the carriage. He had accepted a blanket from someone without much comment and was wrapped in it now, looking out the dark tunnel wall as though trying to read something in the stone. He had the look of a man whose entire map has been redrawn mid-journey. Cale understood this. He had spent the last 3 days with the same look, he suspected, and the days of the blood songs before that. After a while, Finn came and sat across from Miles. She was 14 and done with dances and possessed of the particular social courage that sometimes lives in people that age, the courage that hasn't yet learned to calculate risk, and so simply acts. She sat across from the young human soldier wrapped in his blanket and said, "My dad said you were trained on what we are." Miles looked at her. "Yes." "What did they tell you?" He was quiet for a moment. "That you weren't people. Not the way we are, that you were very sophisticated systems that had become unstable, that reclaiming the planet was necessary, and that what happened to you in the process wouldn't register the same way." Fenn considered this, and now I've met you, Miles said, so you know they were wrong. Yes. Did you always suspect? He looked at her with a slight adjustment of expression, something between honesty and caution. My grandmother did. She passed it on the way you pass things you're not sure you're allowed to believe, quietly, privately, as a kind of protection. In case we needed it. He paused. I think she sent me here hoping I'd find exactly this. I don't think she'd have put it that way. Fenn was quiet for a moment. What was her name? Ella, Miles said. Ella Yun. Fenn nodded. She sat with him for another few minutes in the silence that is not uncomfortable silence, but is the particular kind of quiet that follows something true being said. Then she got up and went back to where her mother was. Cale, watching from his position near the rear window, looked at his daughter, and then at the young man she'd left behind, who was sitting with the specific posture of someone receiving something they had not expected to receive, and who did not know yet what to do with it except to hold it carefully. He had, Cale thought, the good instincts. He had spared a child because she had given a name to a wooden bird. He had defied his command because a thing he had been told was not a family had turned out to be one. These were not small things. These were precisely the things that mattered, the things you could not train into a person but which were either there or were not, and which, when they were there, were the entire argument for the version of the future where none of this ended only in fire. Mara found his hand in the dark and held it. He looked at her. "She's going to be remarkable," Mara said, meaning Fen. "She already is," Kale said. "More so," Mara said. "Watch." He watched. The tunnel moved around them, and the dark outside was the dark of the earth itself, patient and holding, and the amber light of the heating coils ran along the ceiling in a long, warm line, and the sound of 73 people breathing was the sound of a thing that had survived. Kale thought about the stonework in the eastern sublevel, the precision of it, walls cut by hands and nothing else, by a people who had decided they were building something permanent. He thought about the woman who had laughed in the sorting hall and become his wife. He thought about 2 small girls in the rubble of a building, and 23 minutes of sitting still, and the immense and specific patience of simply waiting for a frightened child to understand that you were not going to leave. He thought about Conrath, who had spent 60 years quietly building the answer to a question he'd hoped would never be asked, who had in the end built it well enough that 73 people were on this train, moving north through the dark, alive and together. He thought about the man in the waiting room of the Restorative Wellness Center who had said, "Don't let them fix you. The dreams are real." He hoped the man had made it out. He did not know. There were things he would carry without resolution, and this was one of them, and the weight of it was the appropriate weight, and he would carry it. The 4th track dropped behind them with its soft, final sound. 2 more to go. Then wilderness, then the river bend, then snow. What had been made of it was winter markets. The old district towers, the way the city smelled after rain, 11 years of ordinary days, a cedar wren named Herman, 2 daughters found in rubble and raised to adulthood in the full knowledge, even when that knowledge was sealed away, that love is not a thing you are made capable of by design. It is a thing you learn by doing it over and over in the dark, without instructions. "We'll come back," Mara said. It was not a question, and it was not quite a statement. It was the kind of thing she said when she had decided something was true and was informing the world of its obligation to comply. "Yes," Kale said. She leaned against him. The last of the visible tracks dropped into the dark water with a sound like a door closing softly, and the tunnel took them, and behind them the city continued to burn. Somewhere above, Miles would return to his command with no prisoners and a missing weapon, and an account of what he had seen that would be, depending on who was listening, dismissed, quarantined, or, perhaps, in the version of events that Kale allowed himself to believe, planted like a seed in soil that had been cold for 60 years and was, possibly, beginning to thaw. Miles's grandmother had talked about the winter markets, the towers, the smell of rain. She had passed that knowledge to her son to Miles. Miles to Sevi, in the second between accepting a wooden bird and returning it, in a burning city's sub-level platform in the amber light of maintenance conduits, with the sound of war overhead and the smell of cold stone and the train waiting. What you pass on is not the war. It is the name of the bird. It is the winter market. It is the sound that the world makes when it is working the way it is supposed to work. They were 4 days in the tunnel network before they surfaced in the northern wilderness, in the crook of a river bend where the willows were white with first snow. The children got off the train first, as children do, and stood in the open air with their faces up, feeling the cold on their skin. Sevi held Herman up toward the sky with both hands, as though introducing him to the wilderness. Fen stood beside her and said nothing, which was how Fen expressed being moved. Conrath, who had been 30 years at the authority and had spent 60 years quietly building the answer to a question he'd hoped would never be asked, stood at the head of the platform and looked at the assembled faces of 73 people who had been, until 3 days ago, living their ordinary lives and said simply, "We're not done, but we're here." Cale found himself standing next to Miles, who had come with them after all. The young man was looking at the snow on the willows with an expression Cale couldn't categorize. Not longing exactly, not regret. Something between the two, something that looked like a map being redrawn in real time. "Your grandmother's winter market," Cale said. "Did she tell you what she bought there?" Miles thought about it. "Dried fruits," he said, "and a carved wooden toy for my grandfather when they were young. A bird," she said. He paused. "She kept it his whole life." Cale said nothing. "I know," Miles said, "I know." Above them the sky was ordinary. Cold, winter pale, full of stars beginning to show at the edge of dusk. No vessels, no fire, just the sky being what a sky is, the same sky that had been there before the war and would be there after it, patient and indifferent, watching to see what would be made of this particular attempt at everything. Mara appeared beside Cale, her shoulder against his, her breath fogging in the cold. She looked at Miles for a long moment with the expression that meant, "I reserve judgment and I am watching you," and then her expression shifted, incrementally, the way land shifts after long weather, not dramatically, not all at once, but unmistakably. She said, "There's a fire going at the east end of the platform. Come warm up." Miles looked at her, looked at Cale, looked at Sevi, who was 20 meters away, introducing Herman to the snow. "Yes," he said. "Thank you." They walked toward the fire, the three of them, with the snow beginning to come down in earnest and the city they'd left. Their city, whatever it had been and whatever it would become, burning in the distance behind them, behind the river bend, behind the sealed tunnels, behind 60 years of sealed memory. Cale thought, "I know who I am now." Not as declaration, not as conclusion, as the simplest possible fact, the kind of fact you spend your whole life circling without knowing it is what you are circling, the fact that is not a destination but a point of departure. He had been maintenance, he had been a husband, he had been a father to 2 girls found in rubble. He had been afraid and stubborn, and, in several consecutive moments of his life, more than he had expected to be. He had been and was and would remain the kind of creature who runs toward the sound of his wife's name, who sits down in rubble and waits, still and patient, until a frightened child lowers her weapon, who holds his daughter for exactly 3 seconds in a burning room, long enough to feel the reality of her, before moving her to safety, who gives a young man who came through his wall a cup of warmth and a name for what he is standing in front of. The snow came down. The fire at the east end of the platform was visible now, and the shapes of people around it, their people, every one of them, ordinary and extraordinary in the way that everyone is both, in the way that all the evidence had always already been right there, for anyone willing to look. "They told you we were trouble," Mara said, not to anyone in particular, in the voice she used when she was closing an argument that had never been properly started. "They told you we were infrastructure, legacy systems." "They were wrong," Cale said. "We know," she said. "We always knew. We just had to wait for someone else to figure it out." Ahead, Sevi ran back toward them through the snow, Herman raised above her head, face bright with cold and the absolute joy of open air and fresh weather, and the bird she had remembered to go back for, the bird she had gone back for through the fire, the bird she had held out in a burning tunnel to a young man who needed something to hold. Because that is what children do, because that is what people do, because the evidence for what we are has always been right there in the things we refuse to leave behind. Cale caught her when she reached him, held her. The cold and the warmth of her, the cedar smell of the bird, the snow on her eyelashes and her wild, delighted laugh. This was what they had come to take back, the people in the vessels, this world, this ordinary miracle of it. They were welcome to try.